Architectural Outcast.
Randy here from the Architectural Outcast. Something I am wont to say on occasion, if you're going to mess around with symbolism, you better know what you're doing. Otherwise, you can mess things up 7 ways to Sunday and not even realize it. This is no less true when you use architecture as part of your world building. Architecture is all about communication, communicating ideas and emotions through the use of symbolism. And that's the conundrum that science fiction and fantasy world building faces. You can create an entirely new architecture that has no relationship to precedent, either past or present. And depending on the type of story you're trying to tell, this might be the right choice. But it's dangerous because you risk losing your audience. They're not going to automatically know what your architecture is trying to communicate, and they're not going to know what they're supposed to think or feel about the architecture. Again, depending on the story, this might be the right choice, but you're sacrificing world building for narrative and/or characters. Risky. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you could create a world that is identical to our world. Within science fiction and fantasy, with some very specific exceptions, this is a dangerous strategy as well. You risk losing the audience because they might find it boring and start asking the question, what's the point? Most sci-fi and fantasy world building tries to find a balance between familiar and fantastic architecture. The audience automatically knows what the familiar architecture is saying. If nothing else, they're going to know the technological and socio-economic levels of the world. And the familiar architecture puts the fantastic into context, allows the audience to start to figure out what the fantastic architecture is trying to say. There's no free lunch in life. As good as balancing the familiar with the fantastic is, and it's real good because the vast majority of sci-fi and fantasy world building uses this approach, it comes with its own built-in risks. Familiar architecture is the foundation. Everything else is built on top of that. You get the familiar architecture wrong, kiss your world building goodbye. The problem, the audience, almost at an intuitive level, know familiar architecture. That's why it's called familiar after all. They know architectural symbolism. You get that symbolism wrong, and again, kiss your world building goodbye. In video games, one of the best examples of a fantasy world that found the right balance between the familiar and the fantastic and knew how to use architectural symbolism properly is The Legend of Zelda, specifically the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. These two games take place in the same world, and I will be treating it as such during this discussion. The famous American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, the way you enter into most of his buildings is you go through a low, narrow, tight space into a larger open space. Wright believed in the concept of compression and release. You build tension and anticipation, and then you release that tension and pay off the anticipation by revealing something special. The Japanese architectural theorist Jinichiro Tenzaki, apologies for the mispronunciation, argued in his book In Praise of Shadows that you use light and dark to move people through space. Simply put, human beings have a tendency to move towards the light at the end of the tunnel. We see both of these concepts on display from the very beginning of Breath of the Wild. Link wakes up in a cave and has to exit through a long, narrow tunnel towards a bright light. As he moves along, the tunnel gets smaller and narrower. Tension and anticipation build. When we explode out of the tunnel, it's released with one of the greatest reveals in all of video game history. Suddenly, we have the entire game world laid out in front of us, including our ultimate goal. The very first building that we encounter in the near distance is a large cathedral, and it's in ruins. Humans have an innate fascination with ruins, and this building acts as a magnet, pulling us in its direction. I gotta say, the design of the cathedral itself is really well done. The front facade, you have a central bell tower with flanking smaller towers on each side. As is so often the case within video games, it's not so much a Gothic cathedral as it is an English Renaissance interpretation of a Gothic cathedral. Once you head inside, you realize the damage, it ain't natural. Something blew a hole in the side of this building. This is where developers have sacrificed reality in the name of narrative. This is supposed to be 100 years after the calamity. The structure should have decayed more, collapsed more, but it looks like it's frozen in time, preserved from the day all the damage occurred. But in contrast, you have all the wildlife, the grass and weeds and whatever growing into the building. We see a similar thing with the other ruins surrounding the cathedral. Their damage is frozen in time from the day the calamity occurred. Now, in the developer's defense, this isn't necessarily their fault. This comes from a common misunderstanding about how stone buildings decay over time. This common misconception mostly comes from Great Britain. People visit England, Scotland, Wales, and they go see these castles and ruins, and they assume this is the way stone buildings decay. What they don't realize is these ruins aren't natural. You all see, back in the day when the crown wanted to centralize power, and we've seen how that's worked out, they wanted to make sure the nobles were not in a position where they could rebel. What's one of the quickest ways to be able to rebel? If you find yourself in possession of a castle, a fortress. So the crown passed a roof tax. The bigger the roof, the bigger the tax. The nobles didn't want to have to pay the tax on all their roofs, so they took the roofs off all the castles, changing how the castles decay. Now, the castles decay from the top down slowly over time. If the roofs had been left on and then allowed to rot over time, eventually they would collapse down, pulling the walls in with them, creating a mound. There would be remnants of walls, but they would be buried under the rubble. When you encounter these ruins with the remnants of the walls, it's either one of those castles that had the roof pulled off, or somebody has cleared out all the rubble around the stumps of the remaining walls. The reality is, at this point, the cathedral and its associated buildings should be little more than large mounds. But as I said earlier, the developers are sacrificing reality in the name of narrative. The developers are using the holes in the walls and the weeds and grass covering everything as symbolic of the calamity and the destruction. The cathedral, as shown, is far more evocative of the tragedy and gives us a far better sense of exactly what was lost than any pile of rubble ever could. In my video on Oblivion's architecture, I talked about how its developers' philosophical and aesthetic choices undermined their world building, and how the problem kept getting bigger and bigger over time. Zelda's developers' philosophical and aesthetic choices does something entirely different. It makes the audience willing to overlook things like questionable decay. Instead of going with a hyper-realistic style, the developers chose to go with a cartoon anime aesthetic. People are much more willing to give cartoons the benefit of the doubt, especially when it comes to physics. Wile E. Coyote, anyone? Another thing the developers have going for them? Charm. To misquote a famous Supreme Court justice, I can't define charm, but I know it when I see it. Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom has charm in spades. To charm somebody literally means to cast a spell. When we find something charming, we're willing to overlook a whole lot. The most important rule when designing architecture: the building must meet people's expectations. I don't care how brilliant your design might be, if it fails to live up to people's expectations, it will be a failure. Let me give you all a quick example. If you design a building that looks like a church, but when people go in, they find out it's a donut shop, they ain't going to be happy, and they ain't going to like you. Not long after you start your adventure, you come across your first stable. It's a yurt. Not only is it a clever design and fit for purpose, it logically makes sense. There's also a very clever psychological aspect to the design of the stables: the song. This is particularly tricky because you have to have something that can be played over and over again and not become annoying. The song is soothing and relaxing, giving you a sense of safety and security. This is important. I don't know how many times the first time I played the game, I wandered off into an area that was way above my current level, and the only choice I had was to run. And all of a sudden, I hear that song, and I know I've just discovered another stable, and safety and security is just a few paces away. A problem that most video games suffer from at this point is basically a trope. The interior of their buildings is a lot larger than the outside would indicate. Zelda avoids this problem by having no loading screens going into the buildings. The buildings are exactly the size you expect them to be. Zelda still has the problem that the interior spaces are way too big and there's way too much space in between all the stuff in the room. But at this point, that's also another trope. And again, this is a sacrifice in the name of gameplay. You need room to be able to move your character around. And reference the whole charm thing. People are willing to overlook it. Kakariko Village feels right. It feels like it's right where it belongs. Whether we be talking feng shui or Vitruvius, it follows all the rules. Mountains to the back, river in front, yada yada yada. The village's architecture is post and beam construction, wattle and daub infill, and thatch roofs, all clearly inspired by vernacular Japanese architecture. The village is so orderly, neat, and tidy with everything in its place that when you find a building with somewhere on it, weeds growing in the thatch, it doesn't come across as dilapidated and run down. It just gives the impression they haven't gotten around to taking care of it yet. Personally, if I ever find some place in real life as pleasant and charming as Kakariko Village, I'd be tempted to buy some property. Another thing that Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom gets right, architecture is a powerful tool to show how each region of your world has its own unique character. While Kakariko Village is in a heavily wooded area with a lot of grass, it makes sense that it would be built out of wood and thatch. Whereas Hateno Village is in a drier, rocky area, so it makes sense that it would be built out of stone. Kakariko Village is influenced by Japanese vernacular architecture, where Hateno Village has more of a medieval European flavor. Kakariko Village is orderly and precise, whereas Hateno Village is more chaotic and haphazard. In Hateno Village, you see walls that are partially plastered with a lot of bare stone, but it is so consistent throughout the village that it comes off as a local aesthetic choice, which fits in with what we see of the character of Hateno Village. These aren't people who feel the need to cross every T and dot every I. The very first people you meet in Breath of the Wild are humans, and their architecture is very familiar, almost archetypal. But humans aren't the only beings in Hyrule. Just when you start to think you got things figured out and know what's going on, you go and meet the Zora, a humanoid fish species. Whenever an architect decides they want to try to do something completely different, completely new, the number one rule is consistency and logic. It allows the people interacting and using their architecture to be able to follow along on the journey, make sense of what the architect is trying to say. What would the architecture of an aquatic species with an affinity for nature look like? Well, with the Zora, we get one possibility. Lots of organic forms and lots of water. Zora Kingdom looks like it would be equally at home underwater as it is on the surface. What's the materials it's made out of? Who the heck knows? Kinda looks like mother of pearl, so maybe they're growing their building materials. That would make sense for a species that's connected to nature. It would also make sense that an underwater species would have access to a phosphorescent material, which they would then want to use in their architecture. Amongst all the fantastic forms and mystery materials, there's the familiar, We have Gothic arches and vaults, and there are all the stores and inns you would expect in a town in Hyrule. The familiar allows our minds to gain a foothold. It puts the fantastic into context, helps us make sense of it all. This is where I'm going to call it a day. Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild are two massive games with a lot of architecture to critique. I've just dipped my toe in. If y'all are interested in me continuing this discussion, let me know down in the comments below. At any rate, I hope I've given y'all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to this channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time. And feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.